Greetings, gardening friends, and welcome to our winter garden tour. I'm Stacy.
And I'm Rick Weist. And Stacy, the weather out here has been frightful, but today it's delightful.
It's pretty delightful. It is going to be a short tour because it is still pretty cold, but relatively speaking, Rick is absolutely right. We had last week temperatures in the single digits, highs in the low teens, and snow every single day. So things have improved somewhat. As you can tell, the snow has kind of deflated a bit. We had over 2 feet last week, but we wanted to bring you out here and kind of show you some highlights of the garden, but it's still a little bit chilly, so we'll probably keep this one a little on the shorter side. But we're starting right here in front of this planting with 3 interesting Proven Winners Color Choice shrubs that are looking pretty darn fabulous right now. And those 3 are Stonehenge Taxus, or Yew. This red stemmed dogwood that you see behind me is actually our Sergeant Pepper variegated dogwood that we just introduced. It's going to be new in garden centers this year. And then behind that, we have Paisley Pup Leucothoe, which is also known as by a couple of different common names: dog hobble, lily of the valley shrub, drooping Leucothoe. There's a lot of different names for it. It is actually a North American native shrub, extremely shade tolerant. So if you have shade, Paisley Pup Leucothoe is an excellent choice for you because it has that variegated foliage. And as you can see, the variegated foliage actually persists even in winter for some really interesting foliage interest.
Yeah, and that's the point here, Stacy, as you stand here. When you put plants in your landscape, why not go for 3 to 4 seasons of interest, including winter?
Especially winter. That's when you need it the most. As you can see, this is right by the driveway, so it's easy to see. We don't have to traipse acres through the snow to get there. This Sergeant Pepper dogwood is a great example of that as well. So in the winter, you have these great kind of pinkish red stems. In spring, the foliage comes out. It's variegated. It stays that way through summer. And then as fall comes on, it turns this amazing pink color for a multicolored display. I love, sorry, distracted by birds. I love this plant. Now, it is not one of our native species of dogwood. Some people get confused because they see the red stems and they think it's one of our native Cornus sericea or red twig dogwood. This is actually Cornus alba, which is sort of the European counterpart to that. So just something to be aware of if you're interested more in the native dogwoods, but it's still a fantastic plant for winter interest and for cutting and holiday decor. Okay, now we got Rick back there for scale with the Stonehenge Yew, also known as Taxus. If you're not familiar with this plant, that might be because you live in a warm climate, and Taxus is only heat tolerant through about USDA Zone 7. Doesn't really grow well beyond that, but it is very hardy. And the cool thing about Stonehenge is it naturally grows with this very narrow upright habit. And we love hedging plants that are space saving like this. So you get that nice upright coverage, but not taking up all of your valuable ground space. Now, one thing about Taxus, despite the fact that it is notoriously one of the most toxic plants, deer love it. One of those things I just cannot figure out.
They'll eat it right down to the nubs. I'm standing by it, Stacy, to give people perspective. I'm not a very tall guy, but this is a very vertical plant and probably can get a fair amount of height. I mean, I know everything's bigger in Taxus, right?
Well, and I think you got a little boost from the snow, but yeah, this is a great plant if you're looking for narrow coverage and you live in a colder climate, and of course, you don't have deer.
Right. Stacy, when it gets really cold at my house, like it was last week, my rhododendrons mope. They let me know they do not like those temperatures. Now, these rhododendrons this morning seem to be basking in the sun and enjoying it.
It's true. So you've heard us talk about it on the show before, but when it's really cold, broadleaf evergreens like rhododendron, they try to reduce the amount of surface area their leaves have exposed to the sun and wind, and so they mope. They kind of roll their leaves so less of that surface area is facing out. But on a nice, relatively warm day like this, as you can see, they look great. You can also see that they have huge flower buds on them, and that definitely signals that a great spring show is ahead.
Absolutely, but when we experience winter sun and the ground is frozen so the plant can't uptake moisture, so to speak,
Yep.
that's when we can run into some problems with broadleaf evergreens.
Yeah, so they desiccate, they turn brown, and it's really not a great look, especially for a rhododendron, which tends to be a little bit slower growing. So any damage that happens to them tends to be much more catastrophic than on something like a conifer or something like that. But as you've heard us talk about on the show, we're really lucky here in West Michigan, knock on wood, because generally speaking, when we get the temperatures that we had last week where we're going into the low teens and single digits, we usually have snow cover, and that makes all the difference. So that when the ground is really frozen, they're losing less water, less moisture from the soil because it's all covered up and nicely insulated by the snow.
And I think it brings up the point, Stacey, that when you're planting rhododendrons, one of our most popular shows this past year was a show we did on sunshade and part shade. You have to consider what the sun is like in the winter time.
Yeah.
And in the winter, the sun is low in the south. And if you have plants on a south or a west facing, once again, without snow cover, you can have some damage on broadleaf evergreens.
For sure. So these are protected more. This is facing the east, so they're getting eastern sun, much more protected from the west and the north.
Exactly.
But as you've seen in other videos, I think we actually featured these plants in one of our earlier garden tours this year. This is a good spot for them. But rhododendrons are definitely one of those plants that your mileage may vary depending on how you site it. So it pays to think long and hard about what's the best place for a rhododendron. But if you have it, the right spot, they are so worth it, as you'll see when this thing's in bloom.
Stacey, I want to ask you, we've talked often on the Gardening Simplified show that I come from the garden center industry, so I'm a big proponent of anti-desiccant sprays. How do you feel about them?
I think they're good to use, especially if you do have a very exposed area. They don't usually wear off too early because the plant's obviously not actively growing.
Okay.
So they're a nice to have, but I don't think they're always imperative. But yeah, definitely if you don't get the good snow cover that we usually have here, they're going to be even more beneficial.
There you go.
Here you can see Rick is blazing a trail for us to walk to our next stop on the garden tour. So this plant is something that you might not be familiar with, and it's brand new to the Proven Winners Color Choice line. In fact, it won't even be in garden centers until 2026. It was looking so interesting in the garden right now that I wanted to share it with you. This is Dressed to Thrill Crossvine, Bignonia capreolata. And this is actually a North American native. It's native more to the south, southeast. Certainly if you drive down south, down I-75, in the spring, you will see these in bloom up in the tree with their big, beautiful reddish-orange trumpet flowers. And it is related to the trumpet vine, but it's actually a much better behaved version of it, especially in these colder climates, which kind of help to prevent it from being quite as vigorous. We are selling this as a hardy down to USDA Zone 6 plant, so not the hardiest, not as hardy as trumpet vine, but it is evergreen, so you can see the foliage is interesting right now. We have them trained on these kind of sturdy trellises. And come spring, like about mid to late spring, this will just be covered in a curtain of beautiful reddish orange trumpet-shaped flowers with a yellow throat. And that bloom is timed perfectly for the hummingbirds to migrate back here and find this abundant food source. I am so excited about this plant. It is definitely one of my favorite new for 2026 plants. Crossvine, Dressed to Thrill, Bignonia capreolata.
So Stacey, let's talk about plant dormancy a minute. Dormancy is something that comes along every year. Fortunately, it's a reversible condition. But what I have learned through the years living here in the Midwest and the North is that plant dormancy in the dead of winter, no problem for plants. As a matter of fact, many plants appreciate it. But when we get into February or March, or things start to melt like we're getting dripped on right here,
We are.
right?
Yeah.
If we get some of those unusually warm days, then buds can swell on a plant. Of course, we have a lot of fruit growers here in Michigan, and this is a serious problem for them too when we get into March or April. Once a plant breaks dormancy, there's no going back,
No,
right?
you don't go backwards. You
Right.
can slow it. You can slow it down if
Right.
temperatures drop. But the other aspect of dormancy is it's not just the cold, it's also day length. And that's why March and April get so dangerous, because by that time, I mean, already here in early February, our days are already getting so much longer. It's really amazing. But by the time we have another month, you know, those days become so long, that starts to coax the plants out of dormancy as well. And this is the biggest threat to big leaf hydrangeas like this one right here. This is Let's Dance Can Do. And a lot of people always say, why isn't my hydrangea blooming? I've grown this for years. Why didn't it flower this year? And that's exactly it. So what happens, those warmer days start to come along. They start to let those buds swell. And then because this already has its flower buds for this coming summer, just like an apple tree or a cherry tree or anything like that, if a frost comes along in April or early May, which it almost always does here, at least in Michigan, it can really fry those buds. So we're looking for big leaf hydrangeas that have better tolerance to cold and can survive those late season cold snaps after the buds have started to expand. And this plant right here, Let's Dance Can Do, is one of the absolute best examples of that. You can see, looking at this planting, that this thing flowered its brains out this past season.
Wow. So you would agree, at least through the years, I've told people that I really don't worry about my hydrangeas so much in December and January when they've gone into dormancy, but it's April when I start to worry. I mean, I recall the last week of April getting nighttime temperatures that are in the low 20s. That's when we can do damage, right?
Yep, definitely, especially if there's a frost or a freeze. But it also depends on what was leading up to that. So, you know, very often if we get those warm spells that really swell the buds, so you really need to look at your plant. And if you're seeing a lot of green, fresh, delicate tissue, that's a good sign that if those 20 or 30 degree temperatures are forecast, especially at night, you just want to cover the plants with a blanket or something like that, just to preserve the plant, just to preserve those flower buds. You don't strictly have to, but it's one of the things that sometimes some people find that they do have to do here in the Midwest. Another thing I want to say about these is, you know, people often ask us if they should deadhead their big leaf hydrangeas before winter. And I always say, you know, it's kind of up to you. It's not strictly necessary. But I always tell people, wouldn't you rather look at flower skeletons than a bunch of sticks?
Yeah.
And you can see that these actually look pretty interesting. They have some good form, some good structure. And if you squint your eyes and pretend, you could almost maybe convince yourself that they're still in flower.
Last week when we had that really rough winter weather, I actually was entertained. We had high winds, 40, 50, 60 miles per hour. You called these skeletons. I was entertained by watching them roll on, you know, the ones that have come off the plant.
Yeah, because they are kind of spherical, so they do kind of turn into a tumbleweed and roll across your yard.
I gotta make sure I don't mess up your microphone.
Oh, you're fine.
Look. Oh, this is beautiful.
Everybody always wants to know about ground covers because they're a great way to keep down weeds, beautify your house, add some seasonal interest. And, you know, once they're in and you don't really have to mess with them too much. And this is a fantastic ground cover for shade and acidic soil. This plant might not be one you're familiar with. It's not super popular. This is Sweet and Low Sweet Box Sarcococca Hookeriana humilis. Okay, you don't need to remember all that. Just remember Sweet Box. Sweet and low because it is low growing. It grows like this. It's a little bit, you know, beaten down by the snow right now. But this really is pretty much its mature height. And the sweet part of its name comes from its flowers. And this is probably going to be one of the first, if not the first thing to bloom in the garden, probably in about maybe 4 to 6 weeks, depending on how our weather goes. And when this flowers, you would not believe the fragrance on a early spring, late winter day. It just fills the air with the most beautiful, sweet fragrance. It's the kind of thing that, like, if you live in a neighborhood and people walk by, they're going to be like, where's that coming from? Is someone doing laundry? I mean, it's really, really a unique plant. Are you familiar with this one?
Yes, I am. And there's a lot of interest in the garden center from customers on this plant because, Stacey, many people are not familiar with the plant. This plant is loaded with buds, so it's showing the potential that you're talking about. But in addition to that, I'm just amazed at how good it looks after what we've been through the last month.
Absolutely. And again, it's that nice snow cover that we have. So this would be a good one if you have a protected spot, or if you are like us and you generally have snow cover during really cold temperatures, so you don't get that browning. This is a broadleaf evergreen like we were just talking about with the rhododendrons. And this is a kind of suckering plant. So as it matures, it really fills in the area with like a nice thick mat of roots. It's very easy to manage, but again, it does need acidic soil and it does need shade and pretty moist soil too. This is not one for like where we're always talking about how we're gardening in the dunes and in the hot sun and sand. This would not be a great choice for us, but if you have that shady spot, moist acidic soil, it is also extremely deer resistant and is in fact in our deer proof program. So a great problem solver that also offers amazing flowers, and one of those plants that, you know, kind of does often get overlooked in the garden center because it's not in flower.
And this warms my heart today because that's why we're here, Stacey, to help familiarize people with this type of plant. When they're walking through the garden center, I'd have this in my landscape.
Absolutely, you'd be missing out if you don't. So again, we said this is going to be a short tour because it is pretty chilly. It's also really snowy, but we hope you enjoyed some highlights of the gardens here in early February in West Michigan. So again, I'm Stacey.
I'm Rick Weist.
And we're the hosts of the Gardening Simplified Show. You can find us on the Proven Winners Color Choice YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos.